Good evening. You are listening to LOP Radio. The time as of recording is Wednesday the 5th of June. It's 7:30 p.m. and it's 101 WWE matches to see before you die, the podcast edition right here on the right side of the pond. My name is Plan, his name is Maverick, and we hope you've come prepared because it's March 28th, 2010. It's Phoenix, Arizona in the University of Phoenix Stadium. It's 72,219 fans in attendance. It's Wrestlemania 26. It's match 100, the Money in the Bank ladder match. And my God, does it suck.
It's just horrible, isn't it? I think it's just sort of WWE's very own version of the Emperor's New Clothes in a way, isn't it? I mean, you've just kind of got the absolute most bloated extent of a match, which, you know, has some really excellent iterations, but at the same time, in this case, when they kind of have all of the elements which come together in this sort of way, what you get is a mess.
It's just horrible. Because obviously we go and watch it back before we do the podcast, and I recently wrote a column about a match that sort of demands your attention as you sit and watch it. It's hard to look away, whereas this was the complete opposite. I found it difficult to get through the whole thing without wanting to turn it off, because it just lacks anything. It's just stuff happens.
We got to sit through 10 entrances before you get to anything else. So, you know, I kind of found myself watching 6 minutes of entrance music, which was just bizarre. And I know a lot of people complain about the amount of jobber entrances on WWE television today, but actually I would have loved a few jobber entrances there.
Absolutely, yeah, especially because they're so short as well. Their music's cutting off before they even get to the ring, and they're sort of trying to do all the usual taunts that they do as they go to the ring. It's rather embarrassing. And then they all as in is typical fashion, sort of stand around in a big huddle while patiently waiting for everyone to get in the ring so they can start beating the crap out of each other, which never's made sense to me either.
No, there's no heat whatsoever, is there? And I think the main problem with this version of the match is there's 10 people in it, and I think, you know, that's certainly something you talked about at the time, and I think something you talked about in today's column on the very first Money in the Bank match. Mm-hmm. And I really think that is the main issue, because you've almost got like a third of a Royal Rumble in the same ring, and it just makes it a mess, doesn't it?
That's a very good point, actually. I never thought of it that way. That's ridiculous when you put it in those terms. A third of a Royal Rumble in a ladder match. That's crazy. I completely agree with you. It's the sheer amount of human mass in that ring makes it completely impossible to do anything. You can't build a match around that many people, because you end up building the match around the logistics of it as opposed to the other way around. You know, you have to do certain things because your hand's forced, because there's just that many people there.
They were cramming in every mid-carder that had nothing to do, and some of them actually, you know, really deserved a lot better than being stuck in that match. I mean, Kingston had a really good end of 2009 and beginning of 2010, and for him to then just get thrown in at the last minute to the Money in the Bank match when he'd had such a sort of meaningful rivalry with Orton, I just thought it was really unfair.
Yeah.
And you look at somebody like Shelton Benjamin, who, you know, is basically, unfortunately, at the end of his WWE career, was just being stuck in these matches purely because you knew he'd come out with, you know, spot of the day.
Absolutely. I think that sort of came to prominence, particularly at WrestleMania 25 the previous year. That's when I sort of started thinking, well, Shelton Benjamin was literally by the time he left the company, he was literally a one-match guy. They would trot him out every WrestleMania, but if it weren't WrestleMania, he wasn't doing anything. You never saw him. You know, he might have some sort of pissant run with a mid-card title at some point, but by the time he left, he was just basically there to be the Money in the Bank spot monkey.
Yeah, and you look at his career and you think, okay, right, the guy couldn't talk. He had the opportunities to kind of run with those mid-card belts, and he didn't really get over. But at the same time, there's nothing wrong with him being a workhorse and being used properly as a workhorse.
No, there isn't. I mean, you compare his performance in this one to his performance in the first one. You mentioned, obviously, that I just recently did a column on that, so I've only just recently watched that again in the last couple of days, and it's completely different. In the first one, you get the impression of a guy that wants to walk away with everyone talking about him, who isn't just happy to sit in the role that he had at the time. It felt like he was trying to impress in that first one. You fast forward so many years later, 5 years later, and what you've got is a guy who seems to have just, very much like the Money in the Bank concept had done by this point as well, just sort of lost his way and decided that he was just going to settle for whatever they were going to give him. And I think that's partly the problem with the gimmick as well. It's just lost its way as it's gone along. You compare the 6 men that they had in the first one to the 10 men they had in this one, and a lot of what goes on is essentially my major problem with Money in the Bank, and it leads to a complete absence of any kind of psychology.
Absolutely, yeah. Particularly in relevance to the first match, as you were saying.
Totally, and particularly two instances in this match really grate on me so much. There's a bit where Kane ends up pulling a ladder apart because it's obviously a gimmick ladder, I think. And I think he was meant to pick up the whole ladder and walk away from the guy who'd just been beaten up. But he ends up walking away with half a ladder for some bizarre reason towards a corner that he's not supposed to have seen someone climbing up, just to get drop kicked from the top rope holding a ladder like that's meant to make it any worse than it is.
And then you get the Kingston stilts moment.
That's exactly what I was going for, yeah.
It's still, I think, the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen in a WWE ring.
And it's perfectly evident of the problem that the rut that they've fallen in with this as well, is they do whatever they think's going to wow the audience without thinking about whether or not it makes any bloody sense.
And again, you get Kofi and then John Morrison in Royal Rumble's past. Again, they're just being trussed out because you know they can do some sort of amazing athletic feat. And it's just to kind of fill space in the time when the person's actually going to win the match isn't doing something.
No, absolutely. Kofi particularly sticking. We've obviously talked about Sheldon. We'll talk about Kofi a bit. He's sort of fallen into that same rut with the Royal Rumble now as well. It's like every year at the Royal Rumble they want him to do something sort of mind blowing there as well. He's sort of the Royal Rumble guy, like Shelton was the Money in the Bank guy. And
you almost feel like he only got that position because Morrison left the company. There's always going to be the one guy now. I think they've got that trope. I think it's always going to exist. Sadly.
And it's an interesting thing as to whether or not Money in the Bank, I don't think it would be solely responsible for that kind of a philosophy, because WWE's always been a creature of habit, but whether it's I don't think it's certainly helped the reputation of a lot of guys, because they go out there and they do these crazy things in a Money in the Bank match, and then it's like they almost get typecast.
Indeed, and I think with Kofi especially, he had such a credible run just before this match, and if they could have booked him to win it, I think that would have probably, at least for that amount of time, been enough to send him over the top for a little while. But instead, they booked Swagger to win it out of absolutely nowhere. Where at least Kofi had a push coming into the event.
Yes, Swagger's a strange one. He's I've always struggled to like Jack Swagger from the day he walked into the company and when they did the whole ECW thing. I wasn't happy when he won this Money in the Bank because, as you said, it came out of absolutely nowhere, and that seems to be becoming the story of his career. These pushes out of nowhere, like the one that he's received this year, that once again has failed to take off. I don't know how many more chances the guy can get before they just sort of cut losses with him.
It's fun, isn't it? Because actually, usually people that Jim Ross likes, it's almost as if they would try and spite him by making Swagger look bad. But in fact, in this instance, it seems to have worked in Swagger's favour.
Totally. I mean, the embarrassing moment that they've thankfully, mercifully edited on the actual DVD release for WrestleMania 26, if anyone has possession of that, where when he wins the match and he's stood there trying to get the briefcase off the hook for all of about 3 minutes.
It's excruciating, isn't it? And I think I made a note when I was watching that bit that said his title reign was doomed from that moment. You could just imagine Vince in the gorilla position watching Swagger struggle for about 5 minutes to take the briefcase off the hook.
Yeah.
And just thinking, I'm going to bury this guy.
Totally. I mean, particularly because WWE is so image savvy all the time as well. They want everything to come off so brilliantly. And this is another frustrating aspect of the match, is the guy that wins it is one of the guys that puts in one of the worst performances in there. Because there are, for what it is, if you take it just for what it is just a sort of trashy series of stunt work, you can still find a couple of positives in there. Christian and Matt Hardy do a good job of sort of anchoring the whole thing, and Matt Hardy does a couple of impressive things. He does a backflip onto a ladder at one point that seriously looks like it hurts.
I really like, actually, the psychology of Matt Hardy and Christian being the ladder match gurus, I suppose, in this one, and the fact that the audience as a whole would know how much ladder match experience they had and see them as the people who are most likely to win it based on kayfabe experience and so on. So I did really like that. And there's a moment where they work together, and there's a moment where they kind of have a sequence where they're against each other.
Yeah.
And the whole thing kind of works really well because it's that kind of like, because they're both faces at the time.
They were.
And you're kind of looking at it as like old enemies but also old friends, and I really liked that.
Absolutely. I loved the bit towards the end that on the night I was hoping was going to be the finish, because I was pulling for Christian at the time. I remember on the night that it was all going down, and there was a wonderful bit towards the end before Swagger pops up. Matt and Christian, as you mentioned, duking it out at the top of the ladder, and then Kane comes up and he's sort of teasing a double choke slam, and then they work together on Kane. It's back down to those two, and as you say, it sort of plays upon the sympathy you've got for their history, their very well renowned history in ladder matches and stuff. So they were two of the positives, and Evan Bourne as well, I think, does really well in it for a young guy who's wanted to make an impression. He sort of does what Shelton did in the first one.
Although with Evan Bourne, I really felt at the time as if it was a mistake to put him in there in the sense that he was obviously being in there because he was the high flyer.
Yeah.
And from a kind of kayfabe point of view, he had absolutely zero chance of winning it. So him being in it at all, like, him being the 10th person, you kind of looks at the others and you think, all right, there's too many of them, but probably they've all got a legitimate shot at winning this. And Evan Bourne obviously kind of didn't. And that kind of grates with me a little bit, because I just feel that if you're going to book all these people in the match, you have to believe that any one of them could win it.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that comes back to another problem with this one, where it sort of falls prey to a lot of the more negative aspects of any Money in the Bank match that you want to analyse, where it's sort of much like the better Royal Rumbles, it's reliant on a more open field. If the more people you believe are going to win it, the better the match is going to be. And by adding more and more people into it, like the 10 guys in this one, I think WrestleMania 23 was quite bad for it at the time as well. That was the first time they did 8 guys. You get a bit of that Royal Rumble syndrome leaking in, where you know that there are people in there that are just in there for the sake of it. There's no one that they have no chance of winning it. It was like when they fill a Royal Rumble full of jobbers, they fill a Money in the Bank match full of people who are just there to do a high spot or two, and it sort of takes away from it. And again, what one of the better points of the first one is that it was all sort of upper mid-card guys that could quite easily make a jump into a world title scene, so it was very open. And I wasn't watching at the time, so I can't speak for the build-up to it, but as someone who's watched it in retrospect, it certainly feels like any one of them could have taken it in that match, whereas in this one, as you say.
And I think that's the thing. My personal view on Money in the Bank is that it was never meant to be a cheap way to get somebody over. It was meant to be a way in which to facilitate a title storyline. I don't think the Edge surprise cash in, which happened with the first briefcase, I really kind of felt that when they tried to repeat that over and over again, the actual original purpose of it got completely lost, which was just a way for guys that are out of the title scene but have been there before to get back there. So it was Jericho's idea, at least in kayfabe, to have this match in the first place, and then you've obviously got all of these other guys who are all at that level too. So for it to suddenly be out of nowhere, Daniel Bryan, for example, winning Money in the Bank at the 2011 one. I mean, obviously we all loved that, but at the same time, it was another one that came pretty much out of nowhere, and it was a kind of situation where he was booked absolutely horribly running up to the cash-in on the Big Show. But it was then a very entertaining title run. But at the same time, maybe that was one of the reasons why the 18-second thing happened later on.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole other issue with Money in the Bank, isn't it, is how they treat the guy that eventually wins it afterwards, because I don't want to go into it too much because it is covered in an edition much, much later down the line.
It is.
But there's no harm in touching on it, that guys often win the Money in the Bank briefcase. As you said, it happened with Daniel Bryan, it's happened with Dolph Ziggler this last time, it happened with, not so much with Jack Swagger because he cashed in pretty much straight away, but it's happened on more than one occasion where they sort of follow this dumbass theory that if they make the guy lose, it's going to be a bigger shock factor when they cash in and win the world title, which is completely flawed, because on the one hand, we've now come to expect it because it's what they seem to want to do every single time, so it doesn't increase the shock factor at all, and if anything, it decreases it. And on the other hand, it does the guy no favours, because by the time he cashes in, you've already ripped his credibility to shreds. Dolph Ziggler particularly cashed in. I think he lost on Raw and SmackDown the week after he became world champion as well, pretty clean to someone that was meant to not be as high up as him, so they do themselves no favours on that front.
No, absolutely. And in Ziggler's case especially, the crowd reaction to his win was so huge that then to kill his heat completely by jobbing him out straight afterwards was bizarre, really.
It's insane. I think it's also quite telling. We've gone over a number of the sort of more notable guys that were in this. To say that there were 10 wrestlers in this, and there's not a great deal to say about most of them, should tell everyone something as well. We talked about filler a bit, but you've got, in this match, you've got MVP, who doesn't do anything. Like, I only watched this match a couple of hours ago. Yeah, Drew McIntyre's another one.
But this is the problem I was about to say, actually, because they're actually outside the ring for most of the match, just exactly. lying on the floor.
I know.
And that's another problem. It becomes this kind of choreographed dance where, right, 6 of us will be down the floor, so the other 4 guys can be battling, and then somebody can jump off a top turnbuckle with a high cross body and take out 4 or 5 guys, and then Michael Cole can say something really cliched in commentary. It just becomes that in this case for about 15 minutes.
It's quite literally like they're just going through the motions of it, isn't it?
It is, and you just think, actually, no matter how good any of these guys were, and you look at someone like Matt Hardy and Christian, as we say, got lots of ladder match experience, but even they can't hold this together because it's just too chaotic.
It shows shows through as well. I made a point of quite closely listening to the commentary on this one. As I was watching it, because I'm aware that obviously in my eyes and evidently in your own opinion as well, there's not a great deal to it. There's not a lot of meat to it. So I was interested in listening to how the gorilla position was telling the guys on commentary to beef up. And they really struggle. The commentary is as poor as the matches, which, is all relative at this stage anyway. But it's terrible. It basically consists of Matt Striker shouting a lot, going ooh, ah, and all the rest of it. And Michael Cole saying, and now it's so-and-so climbing the ladder, or now it's so-and-so going for glory, or now it's so-and-so making a race for the... It's insane, and it just, if you listen to it, points out how little there is to it and shows it for the bare bones thing that it is, really.
Absolutely, especially if you compare that to, say, Jim Ross in the Jeff Hardy v Undertaker match from Raw ladder match. And he's like screaming, make yourself famous, kid. And it's just amazing drama because, Jim Ross is so good at doing that, isn't he? But there's no drama in this match at all. It's absolutely heatless.
It's literally what sort of an interpretation of what Matt Striker's commentary is in, and it's just a lot of shouting basically about nothing much whatsoever, which naturally begs the question why it's on a list of must-see matches. Initially, when I originally wrote the column, because I went back and had a skim through that as well, I wrote about it being sort of so bad that it almost becomes good if you just chill out and take it for what it is. I've since changed my opinion on that because I've watched it again. It's not so bad it's good, it's just plain bad. You really have to see it to believe it. But I think there is an important point to this. I'm obviously a critic of the Money in the Bank concept, but the reason I picked this match, and I remember the reason in my head very vividly at the time I was putting this list together a couple of years ago. The reason I picked it and the reason why I sort of enjoyed it on the night was because it sort of validated every criticism I've ever made of Money in the Bank. And I remember after WrestleMania 26, a lot of people were criticizing this particular installment of Money in the Bank for all the reasons I've always criticised it for, and that is that if you strip the concept down out of all of its bravado, you take them and you strip away everything that's positive about it, and you look at the essential concept of a Money in the Bank match, and this is sort of what you end up with, is it's just become a vehicle for spot wrestling, essentially, and seeing how crazy people can get with it and what reaction the fans make to that.
Absolutely, and I think the original one was, like we said, a way to get 6 wrestlers who were very important to the company onto a WrestleMania card and do something unique with them. Unfortunately, they did it so well that WWE felt that they had to then repeat that again and again. And like I said, the thing with Edge in the first one was that he was already over and has been for 6 years. He didn't need necessarily that push of owning the briefcase. It's a great storyline when it happened, but I think he would have been a world champion anyway. The problem is like I said, they begin to think that you can just give this briefcase to any mid-carder and instantly make the main eventer, and it just does not work that way.
I think it highlights a problem that's been precedent in the WWE for a very long time now, certainly for the vast majority since the brand split, where they found their roster was naturally thinner than it used to be, because obviously they're stretching it over 2 shows, and it's a bad habit they're falling into now, where previously it used to be a wrestler becomes a megastar in the company, gets massively over, then he's given the world title as validation of what he's already become, whereas nowadays they use the title as the platform with which to launch the guy to the next level. And I think I read an article where Triple H is sort of critical of the same idea, where the title's being used as a means to get someone over as opposed to as a reward for someone having gotten over. And I think that's this kind of idea and way of pushing people towards the world title doesn't help. Like I said, giving it to a mid-carder and expecting them to just suddenly be validated as a world champion doesn't work.
Well, it's what Triple H says on the Punk DVD, actually. He makes that specific point about Punk's first run with the World Heavyweight Championship after he cashed in on Edge. And Triple H said, well, you give the guy the belt, but that doesn't mean he's a world champion.
I think, and you sort of touched on this, or rather made me think of this earlier on, when you said that a lot of these guys in this particular match, bringing it back to WrestleMania 26 again and refocusing on that, a lot of the guys in that match sort of deserved better at that WrestleMania, like Kofi, for example. It's had an extra effect that I don't think a lot of people think on a lot of the time, on specifically on WrestleManias, and I think we've reaped the results of this from WrestleMania 29 this year, where the build-up's been criticised so much. And this is WWE at its worst doing this, where they sort of got into this habit of taking their more prominent mid-carders, throwing them all in Money in the Bank, saying, sort of dusting their hands off, saying, right, well, that's them sorted. What else? What other marquee matches can we have at WrestleMania? And as a result of that, because they got comfortable doing that for 5 years, when it came to 27, not so much 28, but still sort of in that massive, ridiculous tag team match they did, and certainly this year at 29, it's like they've forgotten that a WrestleMania should involve a well-developed series of mid-card feuds and matches, because they've fallen into into this rut of, well, we can just put him in Money in the Bank and we could just put him in Money in the Bank, so they don't have to think about those guys.
Absolutely agree with you. I mean, my thoughts always go back to one of the matches which is coming up pretty soon on this list, which is the Rick Martel-Jake Roberts match.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a perfect example of what a mid-card feud at WrestleMania should be.
No, exactly.
Absolutely perfect example.
Which was why, and this is part of the reason why, because it was just after WrestleMania 26, I recall that the sort of news broke that they weren't going to do Money in the Bank at WrestleMania anymore because they were giving it its own pay-per-view. That's why I got so giddy with that idea, because I thought, oh great, finally we can go back to what WrestleMania used to be like, where, you had the main event matches and the big marquee matches, but there was still a lot of other things going on at WrestleMania as well, because between 21 and 26, while there were a number of great WrestleManias in there, a lot of them fell prey to the fact that there wasn't much going on in the bottom half because it was all in Money in the Bank, particularly WrestleMania 25. I mean, look at the undercard on that. It's non-existent pretty much.
No, entirely. And I think also 24, because Batista wasn't in the world title scene and he wasn't in Money in the Bank, he was probably too big for that.
Yeah.
So he was just in a random match with Umaga, which was kind of pretty short, as I remember, and pretty forgettable.
Yeah, so I think it's created a problem in how WWE goes about booking its WrestleManias, and I don't think it's a problem they're going to be able to overcome anytime soon. And this year it sort of really hit hard because it felt like they were in panic mode this year, and they had no idea what to do with anyone apart from the big part-timers that they were pretty so sure of. And that's a shame, because you had, on paper, I thought WrestleMania 29 looked really good, and I was very optimistic going into it. I was looking forward to a lot of the matches, and it just sort of fizzled out.
Indeed, and I think almost putting the Shield and the curtain jerker, basically the last interesting thing had happened.
No, absolutely. It was quite...
They almost needed to save that a little bit.
But point being that obviously I think Money in the Bank is responsible for that as well. And this is part of the reason why I hate it so much, is because there's so many things that I think the concept's answerable for. And it's not the fault of whoever came up with it, it's not necessarily the fault of the stipulation either. It's just how WWE have obsessed over it.
Indeed. It's a shortcut, isn't it, essentially, in every way possible. And it makes, like you say, makes it easy to book things around it.
Yeah.
And again, the pay-per-view, you're going to have 2 Money in the Bank ladder matches, 2 title matches, and there's your card pretty much.
Yeah.
There's not much room for anything else.
Exactly, and this is the other thing, timing-wise, isn't it? Particularly 23, I think the match was about half an hour long, and it just takes up time. It ends up not benefiting the person who wins it. Like you said earlier, a lot of the guys involved should really be deserving of something more than that. It sort of just became a quick fix, like you said.
Another thing about the 26 match that I noticed is that it's almost like they tried to pick different styles of wrestler and have 2 each of them. So you got 2 veterans, Matt Hardy and Christian.
Okay.
You've got a high flyer in Evan Bourne. You've got kind of Ziggler and Swagger, who are the wrestlers, inverted commas. You've got MVP and Kingston, who are kind of mildly over mid-card faces. They've just got this kind of way of stereotyping the workers in the match, and it's almost like they've said, right, we need one of everything. Kane, big man, okay, bring him in as well.
Yeah, it's sort of Noah's Ark type deal, isn't it?
It is, and I think that again it's a massive detriment to it, because if you look at the first one, it's 5 really, really good workers and Kane, who's probably the best big man ever.
Yeah, well, quite possibly one of the, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so essentially, I mean, for me, it's very much all the problems of this one boil down to the fact there are too many men in there. I think to touch on something that I've written about recently that we will get to in the far-flung reaches of the future, I think the Money in the Bank concept by this point had certainly lost its way. They'd forgotten the whole point of why it was introduced in the first place. But the reason why I included it on a must-see as a must-see match, and the reason it's match number 100 is because if it's sort of a naked representation of a concept that the WWE's come up with. So if you really want to understand not just how necessarily the WWE decide to push talent to a main event now, but if you want to understand the concept behind what the Money in the Bank match has degraded into, then this is the one that you need to watch.
Yeah, I'd agree with that entirely. It's not a match that you'll enjoy watching necessarily, but it's a match that you probably have to watch.
Yeah, and this is the thing. I mean, for those guys who are listening, this is obviously only the second one. If you're not familiar with the series, there are matches on this list that are included for negative reasons, and we'll get to a few of them in due course. It's not quite as fun when we do come across them as the ones that are on here for great reasons, but it's about must-see matches, and I think this is definitely a must-see. Is there anything you want to add on to that, Mav?
No, not really. I think we've pretty much covered everything about why Money in the Bank is a concept which is deeply flawed and how this match represents it.
Okay, well, that pretty much wraps up for edition number 2 then. It certainly feels like it's flown by a lot quicker than it did the last one. Thank you for listening, actually. we plugged our Twitters at the end of the last show. For those of you that missed it, mine is at LOPPlan.
Mine is at Neil_Holic79, although that might be changing soon on Maz's direction.
Oh, right, okay. I wouldn't take many directions from that guy, but okay, that's your call. So we're actually going to have more Money in the Bank ladder matches in the future, so it's a topic that we'll be revisiting. If you do have any thoughts on this one, again, please tweet them into us. My intention is to eventually maybe start, if any of you do tweet in with some ideas, is to mention it on the show. Unfortunately, we are recording these ahead of time, and the first one hasn't gone out yet, so if any of you do end up tweeting about the first one, then I can't mention it. We can't mention it today, but hopefully at some point we'll be able to work that out, and it might start timing itself a bit better. Remember to put on the hashtag 101 as well. Next up, match number 99, hopefully as soon as we can get it done, is going to be an interesting one. It's a little tricky to find online at this point. I don't have the exact date of when it took place, but it was a street fight that happened shortly before WrestleMania during Ric Flair's final storyline about if he lost, he would retire. It's Ric Flair versus Vince McMahon in a street fight, and it's an oddly comic match to sit and watch, so I'm going to be looking forward to talking about that one.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I watched that last night along with the Money in the Bank, and was similarly horrified. So that'll be an interesting one to talk about.
Totally. There's one spot in particular that I'm looking forward to discussing where Ric Flair does what's meant to be a body splash, and it's fantastic. And I remember pissing myself on the night. But that's the one to watch, folks. Look it up. You can't miss it. Two old codgers trying to wrestle with one another 6 years on from when they did it the first time. Look forward to talking about it, and I hope you're all listening this time next week. So thank you very much.